So I just wanted to kind of go over my inspiration for the topic. So I am Jordanian. I'm of Jordanian/Palestinian descent. And one of my main inspirations is actually my grandfather, who's here. He served in the war in the West Bank between Jordan and Palestine-occupied Israel from 1965 to 1967. And that was when the border sort of solidified in Jordan. So we'll go over that in a little bit, but that was definitely one of my inspirations. When I visited the Middle East this winter, I was able to study sort of the refugee populations and influx into Jordan. And so that was sort of my inspiration. So the topic of my presentation and my thesis is Jordan, the land of refuge. And then I'd like to sort of go over word for word what my thesis is, and then take you through how the presentation is going to look tonight, and then we'll get started. So the thesis is Jordan's geostrategic placement, neutrality towards international institutions, and historical land usage are why Jordan has historically been a place of refuge, most specifically for Palestinians, Iraqis, and Syrians. Due to these phenomena, Jordan has benefited politically and economically from a governmental, domestic, and international level, but has suffered socially. It will continue to be the place of refuge in the future for the Middle East. And so I'm going to first go over the history of Jordan, which includes the monarch that's in place, as well as the historical land usage that was Jordan before borders were implemented. I'm going to define some major terms that will be in my paper and in my presentation tonight. We're going to go over some of the scholarship, the main scholarship that I found during my literature review of people who have looked at this phenomena before, going all the way back from Socrates to people who are still studying it. And then we're going to delve into the thesis, which is geostrategic placement, international institutions, and then the land usage, starting from the Ottoman Empire until the borders that are in place today. And then I'm going to take you through the specific conflicts for Palestine, Iraq, and Syria. And then we're going to look at, in a very current day, modern approach, how the Islamic State and their militia is affecting the refugee populations in Jordan. And then we're going to look at how this is a phenomena and why it sort of goes against conventional wisdom of refugee host countries. So to start off, if you can reference your outline on 1B, we're going to go through the history of Jordan and the kingdom. So the kingdom that's in place in Jordan is the Hashemite kingdom. And in 1919 until 1951, we had Abdullah I of the Hashemites serve as sort of he proclaimed himself as the king of that region. Now this was before, he did this before the land had borders, right? Because the borders were put in place after World War I with the British and the French. So he sort of proclaimed himself as the Emir, so Emir Abdullah I of Transjordan and Palestine, and he sort of had that area go from Jerusalem, from the far west, all the way until modern day Iraq. So that was his sort of land. He died right after Israel became a state. He was assassinated in 1951. This is when Jerusalem was still Jordan controlled, and he was praying in Al-Aqsa Mosque, and he was assassinated actually by a Jordanian who was in fear that he was working with Israeli and Jewish settlers to solidify borders of Israel, which we'll find out later to have been true. After he was assassinated, his son rose to power. King Talal, and he only served for 1 year. Scholars claim that he had a mental illness of schizophrenia, and they didn't believe in his sort of leadership. So he was forced to abdicate, most specifically forced to abdicate by his son, King Hussein. So King Hussein served in the Hashemite monarch from 1952 until 1999, where he died in Jordan of old age. And he's the longest reigning king of Jordan, seeing as Jordan became a country in 1948 with the settlement of Israel. And then we now have current day King Abdullah II, who born, raised, and educated in England, and sort of quickly losing popularity with the Jordanian population. Has a large part to do with the refugee problem that's in Jordan. And then the second part of the history of Jordan is Balad Sham, and that's an Arabic word pretty much meaning the area of the Levant. So that's modern day Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And if you refer to the second page of your outline, I have a map and it says the red part that says Greater Syria. So that was Bilad al-Sham, and it was pretty much a unified Arab world, just under the Ottoman Empire. So no one was necessarily ruling it until people started to, once the British and French mandated the lands, they sort of put in place these governments. So that's Bilad al-Sham as the Levant. So that's some history of Jordan, some definitions that you should know for the context of this paper. Refugees. So a refugee is someone who is fleeing their land for a political, social, or religious reason. And that comes with the idea of the right of return. So with Palestinians, Iraqis, and Syrians, most particularly those who are fleeing to Jordan, are refugees because they have the prospect and they have the right to return to their land once things settle down. That's unrelated to if borders change during the conflict, that they still have the right to return to the homeland that was once theirs. And then we have urban and camp refugees in Jordan. So urban refugees are refugees who have assimilated into the population. We mostly see this with the 1948 exodus, which we'll talk about. And those are Palestinians, most specifically, who became Jordanian and were given full Jordanian citizenship when they were forced to flee to Jordan. And then we have camp refugees, and those are refugees who are seeking temporary refuge, and they're in camps put up by international institutions, both IGOs and NGOs. So we're looking at people like the UN, Red Cross, Red Crescent, and then things like Save the Children, and then the religious services like Islamic Relief and Catholic Relief Services. And then another part of refugee, if you reference your outline, is citizenship status. So like I said, in 1948, the Palestinians that fled to Jordan were given full Jordanian citizenship. And then for the years after that, most specifically the 67 and 91 conflicts, they were given less and less rights. So now they're only given the right to work. They still have to pay taxes, but they don't necessarily reap any of the benefits. And the way this worked in Jordan was they were given these identification cards that had colors, and it showed what their status was and what year they came to Jordan. And that was originally used to see how many people were crossing the border, the West Bank border, every day. It later was used by King Hussein to to allocate citizenship rights to who. So if you had like a red card, that means you were a 1948 refugee and you have full citizenship. But if you were a 67 refugee with the yellow card, then you had citizenship rights stripped from you. That was put into place by King Hussein. And then another definition is regionalism and regional cooperation. This goes back to Bilad al-Sham and how before British and French mandates sort of created the borders, it was one unified Arab world. And I'll go through kind of throughout my presentation, we'll see how maybe the Arab world is starting to become that again. And it really isn't by choice. And then we're looking at globalization and the dilemmas of democratization. And these are things that we see in Iraq and Syria. And we'll go over those conflicts, but that's with the Iraqi invasion as well as the ousting of the Syrian president. So we'll be looking at those things. And then as political scientists, I'm sure you guys have gone over sort of how people identify and how countries are identified. So we have nations that they identify into cultural identification. So it could be a region, it could be just a group of people, a tribe, but they identify similarly through their culture, their language, their ethnicity. And then we have nation states, which are border-controlled areas that have sort of cultural unity. And then we have states who are border-controlled areas with a government, but don't necessarily mean that they have the same ethnicity, religion, or culture. They vary. And then we have the regime, right? So regimes that are either installed, that are put up by the people. We have the authoritarian regimes, democracies, religious regimes. And we'll sort of go over those and how they relate to Palestine, Syria, and Iraq. There's also regimes that are ruling bodies but aren't necessarily internationally recognized, or they're internationally recognized as terrorist organizations. So in Palestine, you're looking at Hezbollah and Hamas, and their legitimate form of government, which isn't necessarily even recognized, is the PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And we'll sort of go into how that affects Jordan. So two Arabic words that are used a lot in sort of describing these conflicts is intifada, which means uprising. And we'll see that in Palestine, Iraq, and Syria. And that's just sort of calling it will be like the 67 intifada or the 91 intifada. And then, it's gonna sound funny, but it's an Arabic word. It's fucking intibat, which means disengagement. And we'll sort of go into how that works with borders on the West Bank of Jordan and Palestine. So those are some definitions that you'll need to know. So let's go into the scholarship. So from the very beginning, Greek philosopher, and I'm sure many of you have studied him, Socrates, looked at populations and territories. He was living in Athens, and he was a soldier during the Athens-Sparta conflict. And after he served, he studied why people naturally, like why does human nature make us attached to the land that we were either born in or the land that we worked in, and why do we feel like we own it? Because land should be a communal thing. So what drives people to feel that sort of ownership on their land? So Socrates is one of the first to start looking at that, and then we sort of speed up in time and we look at Kissinger, which we've studied in political science, and he talks about how there isn't a world order, and how there will always be conflict, and that there is no such thing as peace and harmony. Just by human nature, people are going to fight over resources, especially when they're scarce, so things like land and water. And then we skip a little forward, we look at Black, Jan Black. She's a professor, and she looks at international development and NGOs and how those can either hinder or help develop a country. And she looks at NGOs as hindering countries from developing because it makes the government a little too focused on using them and sort of holds them less accountable, which we're going to see a lot of that for the Jordanian government when it comes to solving the refugee crisis and the way they sort of bank on NGOs always being there. And then we skip to Frances S. Hasso. She's a professor at Duke University studying sociology of the Middle East. So she's looking at why are there revolutions, why are there social movements, and why is there resistance towards the regimes. And then Joseph Massad, he's a Jordanian, he's a professor of Jordanian studies and looks at why Jordan, having been colonized by the British Empire, affects how it is now, and how the colonizer or the colonized will always sort of be underdeveloped in comparison to the one who was colonizing, so to colonial powers. And then we look at David Forsyth, and he's a professor of international development and political science as well at University of Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska. And he studies international institutions again and how those play a part in international development. And he sort of has this on-the-ground primary experience because he was an advisor to the UN and to the Red Cross. So this is sort of scholarship that I've used while writing my paper. And sort of now getting into the meat of things, geostrategic placement. So if you can look at the top map that I put, you can kind of see that Jordan's in the center of what was Bilad al-Sham. So it has Iraq to its east, Syria and Lebanon to the north, Palestine and Israel to the west, and then Saudi Arabia to its south. And that sort of makes it, A, the buffer for Israel to the rest of the Arab world, and B, the center of all the conflict. So Jordan has been sort of neutral towards a lot of conflict. They're just sort of the ones that keep taking in refugees rather than having to be the ones sending out these people or having people flee from them. And I'm looking at that as sort of, there's a few reasons as to why geostrategically they've been the people that take in refugees. So on the west, what separates Palestine or Israel and Jordan is the Jordan River and the Jordan Valley. In 1967, that was when the West Bank was annexed to Israel and put under Israeli occupation, because Jordan used to have control over that from 48 to 67. So I'm looking at why Jordan's West Bank, sort of the hydropolitics of the Jordan River, like whose water is that? Is it Israel's water? Is it Jordan's water? And looking at how like refugees, as they cross that on a daily basis, how that's an issue for them on the Palestinian side. And then looking at, like I said, Jordan as a central point, so being the center of Bilad al-Sham, and how it has borders that touch all of the countries that are in conflict right now. And then the British mandate. So they will always have sort of this Western backing for their Western alliances. And we'll sort of go through how the State of Israel was created by the United Nations and how Jordan had a part in that. And how they're sort of now paying the repercussions of being the land of refuge, but they're actually benefiting. And that's a phenomena that sort of has struck me as being really, really impressive. And then fluctuating borders. So like I said, in 1948, Jordan was controlling all the way up to Jerusalem. In 67, They got closer, they started controlling only parts of the West Bank, and then after the 67 war, after the Six-Day War, those borders solidified and that was put under Israeli occupation. Looking at sort of the second part of my thesis is international institutions, and this to me is the most important about Jordan. So they've always been neutral towards international institutions. Like I said, both intergovernmental and non-governmental institutions. So after the state of Israel was created and Palestinian refugees fled into Jordan, so the UN partition plan happened in 1947. The state of Israel was created in 1948. And 2 months, I believe, after the state of Israel was created, the UN created UNRWA, which is the UN Relief Works Agency for those people in the Near East, focusing mostly on Palestinians. Now, when this organization was created, it was solely a temporary thing to give humanitarian aid to the refugees who were forced to flee their homes. It sort of turned into this cornerstone of the Middle East, being like a political advocate for refugees in Jordan. And UNRWA sort of puts together schools, and we'll look at how UNICEF does that too. But they help not only refugees, but they help the host communities in which they take base or put their camps in. And that's how refugees are helping the government of Jordan, because the government of Jordan is now not held accountable for educating its students or getting water out to the middle of nowhere. Jordan, I didn't talk about its specific geography, but it's a desert and it's very, very hilly. And so there are places where it's hard to get telecommunication lines out to or water piping out to. So allowing international institutions to come in and help the refugees on their land also allows for host communities to be benefited by the same aid. So they're getting things like water and like a free education. UNRWA and UNICEF and the UNHCR are not asking who these people are, if they're refugees or if they're Jordanian residents. They're just giving education to students, and they're giving water to families who are in need. And then we look at the Arab League as being sort of that regional body in the area. So the 22 Arab countries that are part of the Arab League, rather than say we'll accept some of the refugees, just decide to all give a portion of their GDP to Jordan for sort of containing the refugee problem in Jordan. So Jordan does have a vast amount of desert and land, and so they have the land to spare. So they've always been accepting of the money and the aid that comes along with being the host country. And then we're going to look at NGOs. So in my paper, I talk a lot about Caritas, which is an international NGO, but it focuses itself on its regions. So in Jordan, there's Caritas Jordan, and then we have the Red Cross and the Red Crescent that come in, and they have blood banks set up, and they have like water sanitation plants put in. So those aren't just helping, again, the refugees, but they're helping those communities. Well, every community, at least every government in Jordan, is a host community, because every government is bordering some conflicted country. So, and then another very interesting thing that I found is, so King Abdullah II, he claims every time he asks for more aid from either a Western ally or from an NGO or the United Nations, claims that these refugees are hindering his socioeconomic status, right? That the Jordanian economy keeps sort of plummeting every time there's a conflict in the region and refugees are forced to flee into Jordan. I actually found the opposite. If you look at the employment chart at the bottom of page 2, you see that in 2003, which was the Iraqi conflict, in 2011, which was the Syrian conflict, that unemployment in Jordan is actually lower than it has been. And that's because United Nations, Red Cross, those sorts of organizations are hiring Jordanian locals to run their operations. They're not sending people in from the international institutions, they're hiring the locals. And I know this on a very personal level, because when you go to apply and on their vacancy slot, it says Jordanian locals only, and you actually have to put in your ID number. So although those records aren't shown on the Ministry of Labor for Jordan, because they're being hired by sort of this outside institution, so they're considered UN employees, although they are still Jordanian citizens. And that money that gets pumped through the economy is not showing in their GDP. The money that keeps getting given in, that keeps getting brought in as aid is not showing in the GDP, because it's not money that's necessarily being formulated through Jordan. It's money that's coming from outside. If it only helps the communities that have refugees, it's not reported in their GDP. So that sort of is going over institutions and how that has benefited Jordan. That holds the government, again, less accountable for trying to get their unemployment rate down or for trying to have more people join the military. And we're going to look at that in a second on how, especially the Jordanian government and military, is reaping huge benefits, because refugees, especially Palestinian who have become Jordanian, just over the 40 or 50 years that they've sort of taken their homes in Jordan, are not allowed to, they have to pay the taxes and they're part of the labor force, but they don't reap the benefits, they can't join any government, or they can't apply for any government job. And Jordanians, most men are in the army or have served in the army. If your father or grandfather was in the army, you go to a higher education institution for free. Whereas Palestinians, when they were forced to flee their land, decided to invest in their education in Jordan. So they were paying for the schools because even if their family member was in the military in Palestine or Syria or Iraq, they were still forced to pay the full tuition. We'll go into that in a little bit. And then the third sort of massive point in my thesis is the land usage. So starting again from the Ottoman Empire and how the land was sort of all one, ruled by just regions and relative peace. After World War I, we saw British and French mandates go into place. So the French in Balad al-Sham pretty much took up Syria and Lebanon, whereas the British took Iraq and Jordan. So we're looking at how then it transformed to Transjordan, right? And then sort of Abdullah I had really good relations with the British Empire. And so they said, okay, we'll let the Hashemite kingdom rule this area because they're our allies, and we'll make sure that they sort of keep these colonial effects in place. And now they claim, I used to have it before, they claim that the Hashemite kingdom and the Hashemite family are the last descendants, direct descendants of Muhammad. And they are a Muslim country, so they definitely sort of have their popularity from there. And just their neutrality and acceptance of the West, and although the West hasn't tried to touch them in like a democratic way and try to democratize them like we did with Iraq and Syria, they don't sort of mess with Jordan in that way because they know that Jordan's going to have to take the refugees in. So I just wanted to go over the conflicts and sort of specifics with you. So Palestine, the three main conflicts that we look at are 48, 67, and 91. 48 was the official Arab-Israeli war after the UN partition plan of 1947. This is when Palestinian Arabs revolted against the Israeli settlers, and most of them fled into Jordan. The refugee influx for that first time was 711,000 that fled to Jordan. And then we look at the 1967 Six-Day War. That's trying to decide who Jerusalem and the West Bank goes to. And that's where Faqad al-Tibat, the disengagement, comes into place. That's when Jordan said, we'll stop controlling this spot and we'll give that to the Israeli army. And that's when the border solidified at the Jordan River. We had over 300,000 refugee influx there into Jordan. And then between 1987 and 1991 is considered the first Palestinian intifada. And we look at 200,000 refugees being influxed into Jordan. Today we have a total Palestinian population of about 2 million, which is about 60% of Jordan's population. And the ruling bodies, like I had spoke about earlier, so we have the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is the most recognized, and it's sort of the one that sits on the seat for the Arab League, and it's the one that sits on its observer status seat in the United Nations. And then we have Hamas and Hezbollah. Hamas sort of focusing on Palestinian area, and Hezbollah focusing on the Lebanese and Palestinian regions. The Iraqi conflict of '03, which I'm sure many of you either remember or have heard the repercussions of, was the United States Operation Freedom for Iraq, and this was to oust Saddam Hussein. We had gone in during the first Gulf War after '91, and we decided to go back in 2003. And this was to get rid of Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist government, and that's a political party, that's an Arab political party, that's pretty much fully Sunni Muslim. And that's the same government that will see Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The refugee influx after the Iraqi conflict just that year was 30,000. We're now looking at about 80,000 Iraqis that live in Jordan. They come in and they bring their money, they invest it within Jordan, and they're sort of reaping benefits in that way. And then the Syrian conflict of 2011, which is continuing, is the ousting of President Bashar al-Assad, who had the same political party backing as Saddam Hussein, and after sort of crimes against humanity of his own people, war crimes and hate crimes, the Syrian people revolted against him and ousted him, and we have about 600,000 Syrian refugees that flee into Jordan through the northern border. So, with that being said, that's sort of the historical part of it, and I wanted to look at how the Islamic State and the way that's sort of developed is affecting Jordan as well. So the Islamic State, which I'm sure you hear a lot about in the news, was originally Al-Qaeda, or originally held its roots in Al-Qaeda, which was in Iraq. Once Saddam Hussein was ousted, and then Bashar al-Assad, the sort of Islamic militant groups decided to spread, and that became their legitimate form of government. And that's obviously the Islamic State is imposing all of these hate crimes. They're killing people, as you see all too often on the news. People are fleeing from those areas, most especially Syria. And so they're coming into Jordan, and you'll see news reports of King Abdullah II calling on the West for aid, because we're the ones dealing with the Islamic State. And we're the ones dealing with the Islamic State that some scholars have proclaimed to be because of the United States and their invasion of Iraq. So we call on the West for this aid, and the West just gives this aid to Jordan. Well, Jordan uses this aid again to help its people, not just the refugees. The refugees are actually being treated very inhumanely, but they're making sure the water gets sent to their Jordanians. And then sort of looking at benefits and effects of being a land of refugee. So having refugee status varies depending on your citizenship, like I said. So Palestinians have more of a long-term status. They can work in Jordan. Many cross the King Hussein Bridge every day to work and then go back and live in either Gaza or the West Bank. Syrians have very temporary refugee status in northern Jordan, and they're sort of forced to stay in an area of Jordan, whereas Iraqis sort of have a little more freedom because they come with money and they invest it. But all of these refugees are still forced to pay taxes and again reap none of the benefits. There is healthcare in Jordan. They don't reap any of that. Any sort of public school system, they don't get any of that. So those are schools and things that the way that the refugees get taken care of, again, international institutions. And then, like I said about the higher education, so Jordanians, although not many go to higher education, if they do, and that's sort of their last year of high school when they do something very similar to our SAT. If they score a certain percentage, and if their father or grandfather was in the army, they get to do whatever major that they want, as well as it's fully paid for. And then you look at Palestinians, like I said, coming in and wanting to invest their money in their education, hoping for a job in Jordan or somewhere outside of the Arab world, and they're forced to pay full tuition, although their parents could have lived in Jordan since 1948 or 1967. And then sort of how my thesis goes against conventional wisdom and how I thought this was definitely a phenomena. It's conventional wisdom to think that a refugee host country is socioeconomically, governmentally being burdened with these people. And from what I saw, most specifically in Jordan, and because of these three groups of people, and it's sort of been over 70 years of time, it seems relatively solid that that Jordan is benefiting as being the refugee host country, and that they'll continue to be the refugee host country because things like the Islamic State, they're not going away anytime soon. Things like conflict in Iraq and especially in Palestine, where they're still fighting on a daily basis, especially in Gaza Strip, are just going to keep coming back and forth. Jordan will continue to call on that aid, will continue to call on its allies for money. And again, while Jordan always be the place of refuge, so that's sort of like this predictive, futuristic assumption that because of their geography, again, just why it's always been historically, and this is why it always will be, it's the center of Balad Sham, and it's the center of the country's conflict. International institutions have already taken base in these countries. They've become these cornerstones. And I'm not just saying buildings, like People know, people have shirts for UNRWA, and they're becoming these political advocates within the country, and they're becoming the cornerstones because these international institutions won't set up base in the conflicted countries. They're going to set up base in the neighboring countries that are sort of having to assume and assimilate the refugees. And a case study that I found to be interesting that had sort of a relation to Jordan was Tanzania. Now Tanzania has this tribal group called the Burundis, and they have all fled from other parts of Africa to come to Tanzania, and Tanzania has granted them citizenship. I think the difference that Tanzania has, and although international institutions are in place, Tanzania is sort of benefiting from that workforce, and just like Jordan is, but Jordan has stopped giving them citizenship status, has stopped allowing the refugees to benefit from the government. Whereas Tanzania is giving them full citizenship status, which means these Burundis can work in the government and they can serve in the military. So this goes back to regionalism, I believe, because you have sort of this African bloc and the African Union working together to solve the refugee crisis. In Jordan, you have the Arab League and the Arab countries as regionalism, understanding that they all have their conflicts. So sending their refugees to this one specific place, and then you have a monarch that's sort of taking advantage of that. And that's about all I have.
Up for questions from the floor.
Yes.
You talked a lot about sort of the practical effects of what's been going on, but I'm curious almost of the intent, if that's even possible to discuss. Is this type of sort of unrepresentative taxation, do you think it's philanthropic and they're just thriving the benefits or reaping the benefits from it, or is it almost wartime profiteering that they've been doing?
Well, the tax is because they're using their land, right? So that could be, I mean, we're looking at a developing country, right, where land isn't necessarily as allocated as it is here. So it's sort of like our property tax. They're paying taxes for living in the country, just being there. Wartime efforts, I mean, the Jordanian militia, the army is being backed by the United States. And we're arming them, and we are giving them money to keep them afloat. So the taxes are going straight to the monarch to sort of further his agenda.
Well, so what's the intent of Jordan? Why are they accepting these refugees? Like yeah, we see where the money's going at, but what is the intent? Why are they doing this? Maybe ideologically.
So that's because it kind of just goes down the lineage of the monarch. So Abdullah I was proclaimed himself as the emir of that area. And then he proved himself to the British Empire as I will be your ally in this region. You make me the king when you draw your borders. Well, that has sort of trickled down throughout his grandsons and great-grandsons, that we are still loyal to the West for giving us this land, and we are the last descendants of Muhammad, and we deserve this land, but we need to stay loyal to the people who sort of made us. And they'll continue to act, Jordan will continue to act as the buffer between Israel and the rest of the Arab world. Because if Jordan jumped on the Islamic State, or Jordan jumped on conflicts, and now refugees, A, have nowhere to go, unless they're going to Saudi Arabia, and God help them if they do, there is nowhere to go. So the conflict just stays within the region. Jordan will be the buffer for Israel, and I think their sort of ties with the West keep them that way. I also forgot to mention there's the Jordan-Israeli Peace Treaty, which was signed in the 70s, and that sort of, after the creation of the State of Israel, was, although Palestinians are our Arab brothers, we're going to defend the State of Israel, and you see that on an everyday basis at the Jordanian-Israeli border, that Jordan is just on top of the Jordanian militia has the same exact mindset as the Israeli militia when it comes to Palestinians crossing. Yeah.
Does the general Jordanian people take pride in the fact that they're a refugee state, or do they resent it?
So that's really interesting. So that touches on the last part of my thesis. So how the Jordanian society is being hindered by refugees. So Jordanians look at the refugees, so Syrians, Iraqis, and Palestinians, as hindering their economy. If you go to Palestine and you talk to a Palestinian and you tell them you're from Jordan, they're so grateful, and they say, we are your Arab brothers, we are one land. And that's because Jordanians are upset that Palestinians are maybe educating themselves, or Syrians are the reason that aid is coming in, and that the reason that the government is sort of, King Abdullah, especially King Abdullah II, has sort of taken himself out of the realm of his country and just focused on the international relations side and making sure his ties with the West stay good. So Jordanians are definitely upset with their monarch, and that's where my thesis, the last part where it says Jordan is affected in a sociological way and in a societal way, that comes from sort of the hatred of the government being so accepting. Yeah.
So you talked about like the Western allies helping Jordan, and like Jordan being the buffer zone. I'm just curious as to like, is this relationship that Jordan has with the West like affect the way that they interact with their Arab neighboring states?
So as we saw, Iraq and Syria sort of jumped on the same train with ISIS, right? And it was easily spread. Now in that area, in the Arab world, we see Jordan sort of being the only place that hasn't been touched. And I mean, they have, but where ISIS is sort of a grassroots movement in Jordan, we see less of that, I think, because Jordan is keeping the Western mindset and sort of discarding the anti-democratization, anti-West mindset that is the other Arab countries. So I think we see Jordan being not necessarily looked down upon against their neighbors, their Arab countries, because they're still taking in all of their refugees, just not necessarily getting involved. So Jordan has sort of been the neutral country in the Arab world, and that's part of the phenomena of why are they neutral? They're neutral because international institutions are in them, because they shouldn't be neutral if they're the center of the conflict. Yeah.
I just had a comment. So
Yeah.
For your reasoning for will Jordan always be the place of refuge? And you're basically saying because they're always going to be neutral just because of their allies to the West and their neighborhood state?
Yeah, so from a lot of the scholarship that I read, we see like, you know, Israel is the United States' foot in the Middle East, right? Like we're so closely allied with Israel. But our ally with the like-mindedness of the Middle East is Jordan. So by keeping, like I said, good ties with the West, and they don't kick out the international institutions, because like I said, they start off, UNRWA and UNICEF and UNHCR start off as these temporary camps, literally tents, that are just distributing aid. And over the course of 40, 50 years have just turned into buildings that are now advocating for policy, or they're making sure that money keeps coming in even though they're not proving that, you know, refugee populations have gone up. So it's, I think in order to keep international institutions happy and to keep the government less accountable to serving its people, they'll definitely stay the place of refuge. Yeah.
Okay, it's like a two-part question. Like, you mentioned that like the Palestinian population in Jordan is actually the majority, 60%, I believe you said. And so I was just wondering if like that large population has any kind of like political voice in Jordanian government, and if they do, does that sort of lead to more pro-refugee policy?
Interesting. So no, I think I had mentioned, no Palestinians are allowed sort of in any government job or any military position. So they don't necessarily have a lobbying force. So Palestinians in Jordan, just like any other refugees, even Palestinians that have assimilated, are still very, not anti the government, but they feel like the government is not doing what they're supposed to do to get them the right of return that they believe they deserve as refugees. So Palestinians believe that Jordan, their government should be focusing on maybe arming Palestinian organizations like the PLO or Hamas, or we should be like sending Jordan militia into Palestine to strengthen the Palestinians to fight against the Israelis. But instead of doing that, we just ally with the West, right? The Jordanian government allies with the West, and it perpetuates refugees coming in. So Palestinians don't have a voice, because if they had a voice in the government, I think there would definitely, you would see pro-refugee policy, but you would also see pro-right of return policy. You would see them trying to arm people in Palestine rather than letting them have refugee status in Jordan. Why not send Jordanian aid to Palestine? But since there's no Palestinians on the government, and you have to be Jordanian born on the government, you don't sort of get that voice. Definitely not a democracy. Yeah. Yes.
Well, let me ask you the question that virtually everybody will get when they do their presentation. And since we're political scientists, our ultimate goal is to develop theory, right? Just like any other scientist do. What can we take from this that can enlighten us to apply to other situations throughout the world? So there seems to be at least two directions that you might say this paper is headed. Is it primarily a historical piece, which is attempting to explain Jordanian exceptionalism? You know, are they different from how other countries historically deal with refugees, the immigration issue, or are they part of a wider phenomena that we could say? I was interested in the end when you said you're going to look at Tanzania and see, are there any other countries that are like them, or are they the exception? Right? And so then, which direction are we going to build the theory? How does it go?
So so I definitely did a case study to theory. That was the method of my paper. And I saw that the reason to me it was a phenomena is that it's the exception to the rule. That host countries for refugees are burdened with refugees. There's either an overpopulation in certain areas, or there's an overabundance of illegal work happening, or things like drugs and human trafficking become an issue because these people are just trying to get money to live. Well, Jordan's sort of going this halfway route where it's you have the right to work here, you have the right to be educated here. It's just going to cost you a lot more, and you're definitely not going to receive the same salary as a Jordanian would. But feel free, we'll give you the permit, we'll give you the paperwork to work here. So I see Jordan as the exception to the rule because sort of a true host refugee country that's giving them full rights to be able to do what they need in the country to get themselves back on their feet are sort of they're breaking even. They're giving these people their land, but these people are paying taxes and they're working in the government and they're paying taxes, and it's sort of a break-even situation. In Jordan, I see that the government is benefiting far more than the refugees are. It's just sort of cross them over the border so that they're safe, but they're living in very harsh conditions. They're living in camps in the snow, and so I find Jordan to be the exception to the rule.
So then in your scholarship portion at the beginning, where you list the various scholars, which of them have it correct? Which theory then is consistent with what you found?
So the one I identified closely with was Joseph Massad, who looks at, he sort of does the more analytical historical approach of why, because the British and French were in this area, how are those colonial effects still in place today? And I think I just sort of build off of that. Because the Hashemite kingdom had such a strong connection with the British Empire, we see them still allied with the West and being okay taking in this aid and these refugees.
Does he say that in general, colonial powers, when they leave a similar kind of phenomenon? Okay. Let me throw this to the class. First of all, is this an exception to the rule? You know a lot about history. You know a lot about how immigrants, refugees have been brought to countries, particularly after wartime. Okay? Is it generally been that they've been a detriment or a problem, and that Lebanon is an exception to that? First of all, let's deal with that question. Think about large refugee populations being brought to other countries throughout the world over world history, and what that has done to the country that has taken those refugees.
I mean, I would argue that frequently they become a cheap labor force.
Okay, give us some
Like,
examples.
You talked about, I mean, even in the U.S., like we spent so long trying to say no, no, no to so many people, but those who we did let in, there's been several periods where we accepted Eastern Europeans and some Western Europeans, and they immediately became second-class citizens, and we put them in the workforce. Now we see it with Hispanic and Latino populations. We saw it with Chinese and Japanese populations.
Are seen with Vietnamese after the Vietnam War. Every time America gets involved in a war, we oftentimes take in those, particularly if the regime that we were defending falls, we bring them over, right? So, and then the British, they took in the Indians, they took in Africa, the French, they've taken in Algerians, they've taken in, right? So we've got a lot of other cases to examine in world history. Would you say that in France, in the United States, in Great Britain, in China that's taken refugees, and others over time, that typically it has been a less successful venture than in Lebanon, and that Lebanon is truly, you're shaking your head, Eden, what's your take?
I would believe that they're an exception because looking at particularly like, I was just thinking about Spain and with the influx of African immigrants into the southern part of Spain and how it became a cheap labor force, but soon Spaniards turned on them because of the social conflicts that occurred because they're so like culturally different, Spaniards and Africans, and so then eventually they exiled all of them back to Africa, but they left their influence there culturally, which is why you go to like Cordoba and you still see these like beautiful like places and all this kind of stuff and architecture, but they never wanted them there because they were culturally different, so they exiled them back to their homeland.
Also, I think looking like the fact like the U.S. and the European countries like are more developed and don't really rely on like the U.S. aid versus like Jordan, which is like a developing nation, and like they're not helping necessarily from what the thesis sounds like because it's like kindness of their heart, but also more like to reap the benefits from international organizations. I think whereas the U.S. we're like, yeah, we messed up, or yeah, like we're gonna help out as much as we can, but we can afford it without having to go outside to like.
And we're not eligible for the NGO aid.
Yeah, that too.
So, I mean, I have a slightly different take, and I think that the immigration or the countries you've been looking at now are sort of red herrings. And the reason for that is I don't look at this behavior as one of a refugee behavior. I look at it as one of Western appeasement, or the loyalty to the Western countries. And the countries then I would relate to that are those like Russia and Siam or Thailand when they westernized, where they did these broad reforms because you had these sort of dictatorships, these sort of kingships of sorts, where they said, you know, chopsticks are illegal in Thailand, like you have to eat with a fork and spoon. Or in Russia, where they shaved all the beards off of the nobility to westernize. And I think this is almost a modern example of that. This is their opportunity as a country to do some sort of like grand gesture for Western appeasement. So I almost see like them going down the road of Thailand or Russia, maybe not in the same, like, maybe more Thailand because of the sort of geoeconomic factors. Like, I don't think we're going to see a St. Petersburg or whatever with the large car names, but I think we're definitely going to see like heavy, gosh, how do I want to put this? Like the districts of not tourism, but kind of like westernization.
So you're saying the issue then is not about refugees?
Right.
The issue, refugees is one variable or one way in which they can show their westernization.
Right.
But the bigger issue is about a nation that attempts to be accepted by the West. Mm-hmm. What do you think of that, Yasmine? That this is just a secondary variable to a bigger cause?
I would argue the opposite, because it's not that they need to be accepted by the West, it's that they were implemented by the West. So I would say Jordan, if anything, is trying to appease its Arab brothers, its Arab nations, because they sort of are the black sheep, because they're this, implemented, their government, the Hashemite kingdom, was installed by the British Empire in order to keep, again, the colonial effects. For some reason, those under French rule were sort of able to escape that, and Iraq was very radically able to escape that. Jordan took it sort of as an advantageous thing because it happened the same year as the Palestinian refugee influx. Mm-hmm. So, and that's when organizations, that was the same year UNRWA was formed.
So how would you relate them to other countries where they have this installment, like say Vietnam or India?
Allie, did you want to?
No, I was just like, when we're saying like Vietnam and you're talking about like America taking in like refugees from Vietnam, it's a different, I think, an argument, because when you're, like, America went in and kind of messed it up, and so like when we're taking, I don't think Jordan kind of is using the same role as a refugee like state. I don't see the correlation.
They didn't do the damage.
Yeah.
The French did in Africa,
Yeah.
Well-
the British did in India, then they're taking, yeah.
You're both
Good
right,
point.
but insofar as putting in a government, like as placing a government.
You're saying they're like cloaking there?
Well, no, I mean, I think the refugees are a separate issue. Like the U.S. going into Vietnam, and then the refugee conversation that comes out of that is separate than like the French going into Vietnam and setting up, a sort of, a cultural or strictly political government. Or like in India, we know for like there was straight up they just put in a government.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be like a paper topic in itself.
Uh-huh.
For the focus of looking at sort of historically analyzing why refugees, or why one place has always been the place for refugees, when they can go north and go to Turkey, or they can go to Greece and they can go to Saudi Arabia. Again, God willing, nobody does. But like they can just flee. Why is it that they keep going back to Jordan? And I think it comes back to the, like I said, identity, nationalism. It's not necessarily nationalism, it's nation. It's being a nation, it's being a regional body, because Arabs identify as being Arab.
Sure.
They're very sort of soft with their borders. It's not no, I'm Iraqi or I'm Syrian. It's I'm Arab. And why? I think that goes back again historically. They used to all just be one unified Arab world.
So there's an identity, it's like many Vietnamese ran to Cambodia, but there's a strong historic past and ties with those two countries. So that made sense. And here, so when there is a refugee movement into a country where there is, and this gets back to Socrates, right? The idea that you have some identity that's connected to territory is key. Socrates was brilliant, right? So is he perhaps the one who still remains relevant in explaining this? And that's the key, is that they have a cultural commonality that makes it work, whereas maybe it doesn't in other areas.
Question on that, like, since you're saying like and I've heard it from like the Arab Brotherhood is like so strong that you identify as an Arab, but then they're coming in and then they're being taxed differently, that they're not Jordanian. Is that like at all, I don't know, playing a part in, tearing apart Jordan from the rest of the Arab community?
So like I said, how I think that, I was talking to Anthony about this earlier today too, how I think we might be moving again towards like a new Badadachem with the Islamic State starting to take over these places. I think Jordan would be the exception to that. And I think that's where they're like, Jordan Israeli peace treaty, or their Jordan United States like diplomatic relations comes into play. Like they will be the exception to that.
Any other questions? Final thoughts? Did she prove her thesis? Are you satisfied? Did she prove? Anybody not satisfied want to push back a counter argument? Now, see, we didn't. Okay, well, that's a pretty good sign. I think you did a fabulous job.